Hello. Hello, good day, everyone. Thank you for coming in our webinar for the Sustainability Workforce Transformation Program, or SWTP. My name is Red. I'm a verification analyst working with B Lab and your moderator for today's webinar, brought to you by Jan Ashton and the ESG Business Institute. So today, we'll be diving into the world of regenerative business, profitability, and ESG. Guiding us into this journey, who better than the author of Better Business and the Profiteers and Senior Professor of Chinese Management at the University of Cambridge. Please welcome Dr. Chris Marquis. Woo. Hi, Doc.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Red. Wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, and congrats on the new book.
Thank you. Thank you. These books, they look all neat and tidy put together, but it's long processes and usually very messy ones too. So it's great to have it
Messy.
done. Yeah.
You have a stack there. You have a stack there, like behind you. I think I can see it right there.
I do. I have some. Yeah. I have some copies. Yeah, exactly. A little my academics are not known for our marketing prowess, but this is my little attempt to market my stuff.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So yeah, so hi everybody, hi everybody. Thank you for being here today. So yeah, okay, so a little quick glance at your work so far. So basically, Profiteers seem a little bit more critical than your previous Better Business. So what is it? Is it like an evolution basically of your ideas now when it comes to corporate responsibility?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And it's good. Like I said, it's great to be with all of you and all the participants. I think we're going to have some time for some Q&A towards the end. So please, people should be thinking about their questions. The harder, the better. I talk about this stuff all the time and get a lot of the similar questions, which I'm happy to answer. But if it makes it more sort of interesting, the more sort of engaging and challenging they are. So really appreciate people's engagement and look forward to that section. I guess your role. I didn't realize you're a verification analyst working at the B Impact Assessment. I've been studying, researching, B Corps for 15 years now. Actually, started in 2009, and not to go too far into my background and history, but you did ask me a little bit about evolution, so I thought I would say a bit about how I came to actually research and examine these topics. So actually, a lot of my research has been guided by my students. They are the ones who are really, I think, in touch with the pioneering, inspiring ideas in the world today. And yeah, in 2009, I was teaching a class, back in those sort of old days, 15 years ago, when we're talking about business and their engagement in sustainability and social responsibility. It was usually large companies and their CSR programs, corporate social responsibility programs, and the things they did, philanthropy, engagement with NGOs. And yeah, one of my students said, this is, all well and good, what these large companies are doing, but what's really interesting is companies that are putting social missions at their core, like B corporations. I had never heard of B corporations at the time. There were under 200 B corps, at that point. Now, I think there must be close to 9,000. Last I heard, which was probably a month ago, there were 8,700. So I know it's growing very fast, thanks to the work of you and many of the other folks that you work with, making these verifications happen. But yeah, so that started my long journey. I actually cold called B Lab, the global nonprofit that is responsible for the certifying of B corporations, and said, hey, my students are really interested in your topics. I would love to come and write a case study about you. And I did a couple case studies on B Lab. I did a number on specific B corporations. But that then ended up in this book, Better Business, which is really about both the history and sort of future power of the B Corp movement, and in particular, things like the accountability system, so B Impact Assessment, which I'm sure you're you're a real expert on, and also the governance, the benefit corporation legal structure, companies changing their legal articles of incorporation. And I think these ideas are really on the cutting edge globally of what is going to be demanded of businesses. So in Europe, for instance, there's changes in laws around corporate accountability, corporate engagement of directors, and really the B Corp movement is preparing companies for those big challenges. So if the companies are in supply chains of large global global organizations, these items that are involved in the B Corp certification are being increasingly important. So I've been rambling a bit about my background, but let me now turn to your actual question. This new book, The Profiteers, sounds different than this story of companies orienting themselves through accountability and governance mechanisms to be better businesses, and that's in better business. I mean that in a very, broad sense, better for society, better for the environment, but also better performing, better managed. It's actually why I called that book Better Business, because, many of the companies I talked to I talked to them because I was really interested in this social mission that they had. But so many of them said, we went into this because we wanted to ensure that we were walking the talk on our social mission, but we came out of it a better business. And by that, they meant better managed. So I think that these tools and processes are helpful for all companies. But anyway, the new book is titled The Profiteers: How Business Privatizes Profit and Socializes Cost. And that is certainly the title, a much more critical take on this idea of business and responsibility and sustainability. And I'll say a little bit about that. But before I, say sort of what I mean by that criticism, I think that actually both books, in many ways, are like opposite sides of the same coin. In that, but of my broader mission of really seeing business as one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, engines for social environmental good in the world today. And whereas in the Better Business, I focus more on, maybe more of the positives. In this, I focus more on the challenges for business to actually engage in that social good. And that actually many companies are meeting those challenges. A lot of the book is focused on, issues of regeneration and solutions. What I see as sort of the next phase of the B Corp movement. But the publisher really liked to focus on the provocative part in the title. So where I focus on the title is really how the short-termism in our economic systems, which in many cases are supported by policy and regulations, focus business so narrowly, a lot of large businesses in particular, so narrowly on their short-term profits. This results in them pushing a lot of social and environmental costs onto the broader society because of these pressures. And this is this subtitle, How Business Privatizes Profit and Socializes Cost, which I sort of go through. So I guess, sort of long way to describe sort of that evolution over 15 years. But I guess at the root, I think they actually have very similar missions, helping business be more sustainable. Although, this new book here really focuses on more of the challenges of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about the provocativeness of the book and the title itself. And here's the thing, as a struggling millennial here, you mentioned in your book that there are hidden costs that are being pushed towards society, the societal costs that are pushed into society. So what are these costs, if I may ask?
Sure thing. So that title, the subtitle of Privatizing Profits and Socializing Costs, is in many ways a sort of plain language version of an economics concept called externalities. And what externalities are in many ways costs that are off the balance sheets of companies or the profit and loss statements. They don't need to actually pay anything more for, but are common resources that businesses can somewhat draw on. So the business can draw on, and actually the cost for those, if there's damage or problems with them, get borne by the general public. So there's lots of examples, which I'm sure we'll get into in the book that I give. A really sort of famous and well-known one that is in discussion, public discussion a lot now, is carbon emissions. So, businesses for centuries now have been, emitting, various pollutants into the air through, sort of industrial or manufacturing processes. I'm sure all of us have seen this, and those pollutants have a variety, lead to a variety of costs to society. These could be healthcare costs because people that live around factories have greater incidence of respiratory illnesses, greater, in some cases, cancer, lung cancer and other types of cancer, but also lead to climate change as well. So, by, carbon emissions, globally, as they've increased, we're leading, we're having a lot of issues with climate change, which leads to a lot of cost regards to, there's all kinds of, damage, crises, issues with, high temperatures, creating a lot of problems in probably Malaysia and other places in Southeast Asia that people are experiencing that a lot more than the UK. Climate change actually for the UK has been, a positive thing in many cases. Actually, there's but the majority of the world, actually, it's leading to huge economic and societal and health issues. So these costs, companies really should be responsible for paying these costs, because actually their profits end up being higher by just being able to sort of, emit their pollutants into the sky. I mean, the sky is sort of a free landfill for pollution. So there's a lot of discussions of, carbon taxes, carbon markets, regulations and fees, taxes on carbon. And this is an example of a way to actually financially have companies cover those externalities. But this idea of, externalities, I think, and one of the reasons I want to write this book is that it's something that sounds very abstract and economic, but is actually, extends way beyond carbon emissions. So I talk about a lot of, other both environmental and societal externalities in the book. And I think something that's very important too, which I think a lot of discussion of externalities fails to address, is that, a lot of large businesses have had an interest in, basically clouding their responsibility in regards to those externalities. So through communication, PR, lobbying governments, they divert the attention for their responsibility. So on, sort of carbon emissions, around the world, but the US, even though I'm in the UK, I'm American, is the context I'm most familiar with. There has been a lot of lobbying and other, PR basically to convince legislators and the general public that, carbon accountability, carbon taxes are not American. Basically, they're an intrusion into, the freedom of companies. But people don't, maybe it's less free for companies, but actually it's impinging on the freedom of, the general public, which is, frequently not addressed. Reg, you're on mute.
Oh, great. How about now? Can you hear me? I hope. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
I kind of felt
yeah.
that, because if it's like a very a rather westernized kind of concept in terms of, like, let's say, carbon credits and stuff, it's a little hard to apply when it comes to nations such as mine in the Philippines. So it's a little difficult. So, which is why I should really pay attention to your talk now.
Okay,
Oh,
good.
yeah, yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna pay attention. So yeah, when it comes to externalities, right? I think based on what you've mentioned, like the most obvious ones would be pollutants, basically how it impinges on health, how it impinges on environmental costs, basically. Are there other externalities that might not be so obvious, something that we don't usually see, or something that's uncommon that is very much affecting us?
Sure. Sure. So I'll say a couple things. Like one section of the book, in some ways try to analyze these externalities. And I look at it basically, six different broad types. So we talked about air pollution, with carbon emissions and other types of pollutants. Another one is, waste in general, and I focus a lot on plastic waste in that chapter. Another one that is a bit more on the environmental side is regards to nature and sort of things like agricultural practices affecting biodiversity. Is another. So the environmental ones frequently are a little more well known. There's a variety of societal ones too, and these can regard things like income inequalities, labor conditions, wealth inequality as well. Also things like various forms of discrimination and racism. So I think that the environmental ones are frequently more talked about. And the societal ones are the ones where one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because there is a lot of research and work identifying how actually within like supply chains, for instance, and other more macro sets of measures around inequality, that actually, the one at a macro level, the more inequality there is, the GDP of a country is lowered. And the way that happens is that, as GDP, or excuse me, as, inequality gets higher, the wealthy actually basically carve out more and more benefits for themselves, which creates a lot of worse conditions for the less well off. And these, even though the wealthy are getting sort of disproportionate benefits, the overall GDP declines because of these issues, that the lower life expectancy, greater disease rates, lower education, that are sort of being borne by the less fortunate. And you see this playing out globally too. Most of my experience, I mean, I have spent time living in China, which is, I'm not sure, per capita income, it's pretty, it's a middle income, or even some, for a while it was a, not that long ago, it was actually lower middle income country, although the large cities, there's a tremendous development, and certainly I've not been to Philippines yet. Hopefully I'll make it there sometime, although I've been to lots of other places in Southeast Asia. Just recently last year with Janesh Tim doing some things in Malaysia. I've been to Singapore many times, Vietnam a number of times, Laos, Cambodia. But so I think that a lot of, or not, I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of work that shows that actually a lot of the disproportionate cost of these externalities get borne by global South, so to speak, countries. So be it Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, labor rates and environmental issues are disproportionately focused there. And some companies, I mean, I do want to talk some about what companies are doing positively on this, because actually a lot of the book is around solutions. I know maybe this has been a sort of a downer for our listeners to hear all the bad things. But for instance, one company that I discuss, so these chapters, so I listed all these externalities, and part of what I do actually is I say, okay, here are these ways where actually there's some gaps in accountability and responsibility that companies have regarding how their how their production is structured, and then showing that actually there are some companies that are doing really, really good job. So Tony's Chocolonely, I don't know if that's a popular brand in Southeast Asia. It is in the US and Europe. It's actually a Dutch, Netherlands-based chocolate company. And they are very, very focused in their social mission on, eliminating child labor and slavery in the cacao supply chain, both their own supply chain, but then also creating broader structures so that other chocolate companies can actually, sort of have traceability and ensure that actually, the materials and natural materials that they're using in their products are actually engaged, you're actually, ethically sourced. And so they've gone through and done a lot of work in their supply chain, surprising, in the, places like Europe and the UK and the US, the major chocolate companies are really engaging in pretty egregious abuses
Mm-hmm.
in their supply chains. And I think many people don't realize this. So one of the things Tony's Chocolonely is trying to do awareness, on this. So so they actually go very deep in the supply chain and do a lot of, sort of investigation and research, and have set standards around, the people that work in the supply chains, the level of, sort of the UN has a Declaration of Human Rights, regarding access to housing, and they sort of, work to ensure that the workers actually are sort of at that level, as well as a variety of environmental things as well. And this costs them hundreds of thousands of euros more for their production. But it's an example of a company that's sort of trying to say, okay, we're going to go into our supply chain and really try to identify these inequities and address them. And the book actually has a lot of sort of forward-looking positive examples too of companies that are saying, okay, we want to be creative in how we are addressing these issues.
It's actually great to know that there are, it's all out there right now that they're, addressing them. Especially, I'm actually like Googling Tony's right now because
Okay, good.
we don't have this here in the Philippines.
Okay.
So I'm like looking at it now. This is cool because as far as I know, chocolate industry can be a little, iffy, as we know.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great to know that there's something like this. So hoping there's more now. And when it comes to corporates and their responsibility either towards environment to their towards your stakeholders,
Yeah.
you mentioned gaslighting in your book. Now, this is the first time I think I've heard of gaslighting that is not on a emotional abuse type of context. So here we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of gaslighting, what is this corporate gaslighting that you've mentioned?
Sure. Yeah, good to know you have some sort of familiarity with the concept of it, sort of emotional abuse.
Emotional
So,
abuse.
yeah, and I, typically, it's an interpersonal dynamic. It came from this movie called Gaslight,
Yeah.
where some, some, sort of, I think, got, sort of con man was after the inheritance of some woman, and he,
Yeah. You're
did all
flicking
these
the
things to
lights
make her think,
outside.
flicking the gas lights, all in other things to make her think that she's crazy. And generally, and this term is used actually pretty liberally in, in the U.S. now, but it's about, in some ways, trying to convince the victim that, the problems that the sort of perpetrator of the abuse is doing are sort of their issue and problem. And I think that, this is something that companies have been very, very adept at over the years, making sort of the responsibility for what they're doing that is damaging the environment sort of our responsibility. We're sort of the victims of their production, but we're sort of the ones who end up, or their waste or their carbon emissions, who we think it's our responsibility. So, there's been most of these examples that I've given. I think it's a global phenomenon, but I've given it in the U.S. because that's the context I sort of grew up in and know sort of details of the most. There's been a lot of, for instance, recycling is an example. Plastic recycling. There is so much communication and promotion of this by the basically packaging industry, beverage industry, petrochemical industry. And they've done a lot of things, like, for instance, there's this chasing arrow diagram that's on the bottom of plastic items that has a number in the middle. There's lawsuits where a lot of their private materials have been disclosed, where they're saying, this number 5 can never be recycled, but if we put the 5 there, people will think it's recyclable, so they won't actually be, on our case about, not using that material. Plastic recycling rates nowadays are, even the things you put in the bins, under 10%. But still, there's a lot of communication about how, this idea of once things leave a factory, it should be on, your responsibility, consumer, not sort of our responsibility as a company to actually be innovative and creative to sort of reduce or replace with other materials, reformulate products in order to actually avoid using plastic altogether. So this is an example of, I think, where there's been, tons of PR and communication to deflect responsibility from companies to consumers, and for responsibility to consumers. And I go through a variety of different strategies that companies engage in on this. So one is called astroturfing. I'm not sure if you're familiar. I see you're going to Google again, astroturfing. So what might actually come up is the name astroturf is actually from a artificial grass that was created, I think, in the United States in the 1960s and used in sort of indoor stadiums. And companies actually are frequently nowadays creating these groups that sound like they're grassroots citizens oriented groups. They have names like, some of this work that's done in the plastic industry. I forget, by a group called Keep America Beautiful, I think is the name of the group. Keep America Beautiful. That sounds like very, very noble and things that company, that maybe individuals founded to make their communities better, but really it's founded and funded by these large corporations that actually want to convince the general public that they that they should be taken advantage of. Yeah. Other things are like greenwashing, people are familiar with, and other strategies as well. So this is the idea of, and why I think it's important to focus on externalities, because they're not just like economics and accounting ideas, but actually they are, very much been sort of constructed through communication, PR, and lobbying for companies to make it think there are things that are our individual responsibilities opposed to their responsibility.
I mean, as consumers, though, like, do we have like what can we do to be more vigilant of these things that might be, we might be being gaslighted by corporates now, something like that? Is there a way
I think
for us
I think part of it is understanding is part of it. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, to try to, increasingly help understand this. I think there is increasing, I'm seeing sort of awareness, particularly around things like plastic, more and more these days. I think also, as far as like interventions, policy actually is very, very helpful. And, citizens can work to help, sort of get their governments to enact policy on these issues. The EU has been very active on this. They have something now called a green claims law, which was just enacted maybe about a year or two ago, which specifically targets greenwashing. So companies can't be claiming things are green. They have to actually be able to prove that they're green. So this is actually one angle at this. Things like plastic, there's a number of places around the world. Europe is leading on this. Other places where they have, these extended producer responsibility laws, so that companies, actually have to take responsibility for the materials that they use after they sort of leave the factory gate, not just, it's your problem, consumers.
Yeah.
So those are a few things that I think could be done.
Yeah, that's actually what I kind of hear. It's your problem now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so when it comes, we're talking about profits now and maximizing profits for corporates, but when it comes to them, when it comes to creating this positive impact, is there other motivations to positive impact other than it's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, the companies are seeing it's the right thing to do, and their leaders are thoughtful and visionary in many cases on these topics. I think that sort of two areas where I think it really leads to a lot of potential as far as the long-term sustainability of the company. And I mean that as far as sort of viability, financially moving forward as well, is that, the world, it does really seem, is taking these issues more and more seriously. So I mentioned a number of these EU laws. Actually, when I was in Malaysia in December, as well as some folks from Janashtim, actually visited one of the trade minister's offices because they were really wanting to engage deeper in the small, medium-sized enterprises in Malaysia on their generally ESG activities and behavior. And the reason being is that they see that as a competitive advantage for Malaysia as a country, because a lot of these small, medium-sized enterprises are in the supply chains of EU companies. And the EU companies, because the legal changes there, are going to have to be actually accountable for, the emissions, human rights, other aspects in their supply chain. So, the Malaysian government sees this as a way for future competitive advantage, and I think that applies as well to companies. If you look at how extended supply chains are throughout the world, actually, with these accountability and responsibility frameworks in the EU, it's only going to be more and more that companies are going to be, required to do this. So it's better to get moving on it now because it's also the right thing to do. Consumers as well may, you mentioned you're a millennial. There's a lot of I'm my generation is driving all kinds of polluting cars and various things, but for trying to be green as well. But I do think there is research that younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, et cetera, are more engaged in sustainability. Although I do think there's conflicting evidence on that. It's not fully clear if, we can get actually consumers to actually drive this, because, there has been this explosion of fast fashion and companies like Shein and Temu that are really, you can get things for very, very cheap, but the environmental impact and the societal impact of that is a little more questionable. So I think that's some reasons why I think the companies should be really seriously thinking about this.
Yeah, I kind of felt that, that ethical dilemma there where you buy it cheap because you're struggling, or you want to go for something more, let's say, organic, but it's going to break the bank and
Right.
stuff. So, a lot of, I guess, younger generations that are kind of like starting their lives right now is kind of having that kind of ethical dilemma, which is kind of
Yeah.
sad because we want to do this right, but our wallets are crying. But yeah, but yeah.
It is definitely a challenge. And it's not just young people, but I mean, I think, lower income in general. I think that,
Mhm.
there a challenge that this sector has faced for a very, very long time is sort of this Patagucci phenomena. Patagonia is this
Yeah,
famous, sort of
yeah.
famous sustainable focused company, has amazing environmental consciousness and effort, but it's a premium priced product. I mean, it's not exactly the same level as Gucci, but actually there is a premium. The products are expensive, and I think a lot of times the more sustainable alternatives end up being more expensive. They last longer. And I think there's also an attention to quality there. But that's definitely a tension.
I feel that every time I walk through the grocery, oh, do I buy something organic or do I buy something that's gonna make me full? But but yeah. So basically, there has to be some kind of reform or transformation that has to happen within the systems. And you mentioned that as well, that there has to be transformation of the whole system
Yes,
other than just a reform. So can you tell us more about that?
sure. I mean, so it's like system reform sounds both very, very ambitious, broad, and also very sort of abstract. And it's one of these things that as I was doing the research for this book, uh, I was really surprised that so many of the social entrepreneurs and change leaders that I talked to, they all had their like one particular thing that they thought if we just all did this, like the world would become sort of some better place. Carbon markets are an example of this. I mean, some people think, if you introduce carbon markets, that'll basically solve, everything. Some people think, accountability frameworks, if companies are transparent, this will drive lots of change. Other people, it's a variety of sort of investment market issues, investment market topics. It's funny. One person, I've heard so many people say, this is, we need to do this. It's not someone I talked to when I was doing the research for the book, took me aside and said, I have the solution to our, sort of climate crisis. And I'm like, oh, okay, what is it? And they said blockchain. I guess, sort of blockchain can save everything, I guess. So I guess part of what I do and why I want to focus on systems is that it's a complex challenge that requires action on scores of different, sort of topics and areas. Policy is an important part of that. I think that some of the things the EU is doing around accountability, around anti-greenwashing are very, very important parts of that. I think where I see corporate action and things like, maybe some of the listeners today, participants today, the work of B Lab, B corporations, Janashtim are really important. Is actually creating innovative models that actually can work. The sort of the number of B Corps will always be very, very small because it's a rigorous and meaningful system. And not all companies can actually, engage in that. However, there's hundreds of thousands of companies that use the B impact assessment. There's tens of thousands of companies that are, certified benefit corporations across many different countries. Many of the EU legislations actually have involved, B Lab in their consultations and actually are taking some of those principles to the policy level. So I think that, voluntary work on companies to, create new models. And I don't know how long, Red, you've been a, sort of verification analyst, but good.
About 2
How
years,
many?
I think. About 2 years, I
2
think.
years? Okay.
Yeah.
So you've just mainly been on the version 6 of the
Yeah,
BIA.
pretty
Is that
much.
right? But
Yeah.
however, when I, first started talking to B Lab, I think they were on like version 2, and
Babies.
yeah. So, and this is, so, this has changed over time, and evolved, and how to measure, be accountable. Like the conception of that has changed very, very fast, actually. I mean, it seems like it's been very slow, but if you think about like our convergence on, profit and loss statements, various ways of balancing the books as far as companies, balance sheet, those standards took hundreds of years to actually sort of codify and refine. And we need the same sort of process, although definitely a lot shorter, around corporate accountability for ESG factors. And so corporate processes around accountability governance are hugely important to these sort of broader system changes. Investment markets and ownership structures, also really important. I go through a variety of sort of changes to orient the investment markets to more long-term. And in consumers, we play a role too. So I guess, for broader sustainable business, we need all of these different actions, and some will move ahead faster at certain times than others. In the U.S. now, I just actually returned to the U.K. from the U.S. yesterday, and there's a lot of discussion of the U.S. election right now. And if Donald Trump is elected, I think that's a time when policy on these issues will pull back, and maybe we'll need more sort of voluntary to So anyway, so it's something that there needs to be action on many different sectors, and many and each sector has a variety of different roles to play.
Oh, for sure. And you mentioned there is a need to have a more an innovative model. And you mentioned and in your book, there is something about regenerative business models. So I wanted to dive into that, because this is the first time I'm hearing of regenerative business models. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, this is something that I've really been doing a lot of sort of thinking about, and probably is the area I'll probably focus on sort of next. My next sort of major book, I think, might actually focus on this idea of regeneration, because it is something that is starting to get a lot of sort of pickup and discussion. And I'll tell a story, I guess, of really when the light bulb went off for me about the power of this, and it has to do with Patagonia. So Patagonia, in some ways, I hate to always be using them as an example, because they get used a lot as an example, but I think in this case it's worth it using as an example, because it shows how their thinking actually was transformed on the topic of sustainability as well. So I've done a lot of research and interviews at Patagonia over the years, and one of the people that has been very influential to my thinking is named Vincent Stanley. And he's worked for Patagonia for 40 years. He's related to the founder. He's written a number of books about Patagonia, some of these famous books, one called The Responsible Company. He co-authored with the founder of Patagonia, Jan Chouinard. And he said to me, a huge transformation in Patagonia occurred when they got into the food business. So Patagonia is best known for its apparel, jackets, outerwear, also climbing equipment. It got its start actually making mountain climbing equipment, but also in 2012 started a business called Patagonia Provisions, which sells a variety of food, and they sell beer now too, which when I was in the U.S. recently, I sort of tried some of their beer, which is pretty good. But they realized when they got in the food production business that if you orient the supply chain and production in a thoughtful way, you can actually create positive effects on the natural environment, on soil quality, on biodiversity, than if you hadn't done that. So this is the idea of regeneration, is that you're not just sort of doing less harm, you're actually positively giving back to the broader ecosystem or society. And so at the time when they sort of were starting to get into the food production and learn about this sort of power of regeneration, the Patagonia mission statement had this a clause in the statement, with do as little harm as possible. And they realized that wow, this is really something. Here we're so devoted to the environment, but in our mission statement, we're admitting that we do harm by sort of saying do less harm. And they thought this was like really very inconsistent in like what they really want to do as a business and actually what their avowed mission statement was. And so this really set off a lot of rethinking in the organization. Patagonia's current mission statement is, we're in business to save the planet Earth, or to save our home planet. So they changed their mission statement. They actually reoriented their entire value chain for their products. So from how the materials are sourced, looking for regenerative sources for their natural materials like cotton, really trying to reduce a lot of the, things like polyester, et cetera, and focus on natural materials that are gazed, that are sort of not as naturally sourced, how their products are manufactured, all the way through the end use to consumer. Because, like the plastic example we talked about many times, when companies, sell things, they think like, oh, our job is done. Well, Patagonia has set up, very innovative repair, secondhand marketplaces to extend the life of their products. And so this idea of regeneration, so one is about actually creating, business systems so that there's a net positive effect of the business. And this encompasses the entire sort of value chain, both things like, materials, but also how to engage with consumers. And there's a number of companies now that are really, sort of working on this topic. Another one that I've studied a bit is Natura, which is a Brazilian cosmetics company. They're very active in sort of thinking through biodiversity in the Amazon and how they can actually, through the sourcing of their, ingredients, contribute positively, et cetera.
Mhm. When it comes with just the word of regenerative business, I think the first thing I would think about would be anything that is related to agriculture. But with how you
Yes,
explained it, it's a lot more complex than just agriculture. It has to be
right.
very much structured.
Totally. And there is, and I should say too, so one of the things that I mentioned when you asked about system change that I should have mentioned that I did not, is the importance of working together in collective action and companies, sort of partnering to spread best practices and develop best practices. So to your point about regeneration, yes, I think the roots of that idea are from agriculture. And, so I mentioned Patagonia, sort of got this inspiration from its work on products, but they've also been very active in trying to create standards around regeneration. So they're Patagonia, other companies, around the world are working to, the standards have been developed, but spread a regenerative organic standard for agriculture, which is, there's like sort of like organic label or fair trade label. This is a certification that, producers can use to say, their products, the materials in them are, sourced through a regenerative organic standard. Because an issue, relates to the gaslighting theme, greenwashing theme, is that it's really easy to say regenerative. You don't, there's no policing on that. So it's important to have standards like the B Impact, like B Lab, B Corp certification, that actually consumers can know and trust. And by working together is an important way that companies can help, push those things forward.
And our roles as consumers, what do we do with this type of information? How do we get to it?
Yeah, no, I think it's something that, that sort of like the B logo. I think part of the responsibility is on companies to actually be, make those labels mean something, and consumers also, sort of when you look for products to buy, uh, you know, sort of prioritize companies that are, socially and environmentally responsibly produced.
Okay, so um, yeah, I think we're nearing the end, but I think there's one more question.
Oh,
Just
great. Okay.
one last question for me. So, basically, in your work right now, in your career, and everything you've worked on so far with your books, what would you see as, how would you say, okay, this is pretty much success right now?
Success. So success in regards to, like what I see my success would be like, okay, like communicate these ideas, what the success would
Yeah,
be.
I guess,
Is that?
yeah. Like
Yeah.
like how would you say if oh this is have been replicating what I've been writing and stuff like that? Like if you've seen it, I guess already been done.
I think so. I have seen it some. So to me, I think, I, I I think that how the change we need to make for the health of our planet, for the health of societies around the world, it requires a lot more than just voluntary corporate action. So, so as a first order, in some ways, success, I think it is actually companies adopting and learning. And I do see that. I mean, I don't know if for my books necessarily, but certainly I do a lot of teaching, you know, in executive teaching, and I can see sort of the impact there. Where I think it's the most important, and this is a little bit further on, and I think is eventually some of those ideas getting encoded in policy so that they're also things that all businesses need to need to engage in. And I have been involved a little bit in various policy discussions, both in the EU and other countries too. But I think that's where, I think as we need to address our climate crisis and inequality problems, eventually some sort of policy interventions are necessary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, actually. This has been a very insightful talk, Professor. So yeah, you got me speed running through Google with some of the stuff that I needed to learn further. So
Okay, great.
yeah. So okay, so our dear audiences, now we would like to open the floor for questions. So there's two ways of doing this. You can click on the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen. I will call on you to unmute your mic and you can ask your question. Or you can type your questions in the Q&A chat box, so we'll read it out loud for you, and Professor Chris here will respond. So yeah, we encourage everyone to participate, make the most out of this opportunity, guys. We have a pro here. So yeah, please remember to keep your questions concise and relevant to our topic. So let's begin. Who is the winner for this? Who will be contestant number one here? Oh,
Yeah.
Subashini. Oh, I can see you raising your hand.
Great. Okay,
Hi.
good.
Hi, Red. How are you
Hey,
doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for.
Hello. Now, Subashini, very nice to meet you. Where are you located today?
I'm from Malaysia, and when you keep saying that you were in Southeast Asia, and I joined your call when you were talking about with the B Corp for the Ganesh team
Uh,
on behalf of Ganesh
oh,
team.
great.
Yeah, so that was really a great
Super.
session that we heard all about the B Corp, and our B Corp community
Thank you.
joined and asked a lot of questions during your time in Malaysia. Thank you for that. And
Did
of
you work?
course,
Do you work at do you work at a B Corp,
yeah,
Subashini?
I'm also an IVA, and yeah,
Okay, great.
I like Fred, and I'm the regional lead for the IVAs in Malaysia, Singapore team. So
Great. Okay,
yeah,
good. Well,
so
you're the real expert, I guess. You and Red. So
yeah. I mean, of course, you have done so much research on B Corp as well, and with a lot of companies. So my question will be, today's session was really insightful. Thank you so much for that, and we learned a lot from your talk, and of course, looking forward to read your book so that we
thank
get
you.
more insight about all these ESG and sustainability. Yeah, like you were saying, Malaysia also like right, very interested in having all the small companies, or it doesn't mean small, big,
Right.
or what, but all would like to be a common thing now is ESG and being sustainable and start practicing sustainability, right? But there's
Right.
always roadblocks when, especially for small, medium companies and all. So, do you have any suggestion, ideas, or any strategies that this kind of small businesses or any corporate companies can use whenever they are encountering any kind of roadblocks when they are trying to implement sustainability practices?
Yeah, good question. I mean, and I guess it's in many cases sort of ends up, with the roadblock, what's the specific roadblock is. Um, some of them, if it had like on the environmental side, there might be some sort of upfront cost involved in which may have some sort of longer term, payoff. And I think those are things that could be sort of calculated in a business case made. So that's sort of one area that, some sort of business case. I think it's harder though for a little bit, maybe a B Corp as an example, which has it has environmental aspects, but does the brand lead itself to anything? Let me actually my AirPods have run out of battery, so I want to make sure that can you hear me now still? Can someone respond? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, of course,
Okay,
we can
great.
hear
Okay,
you.
great. So, yeah, so I think there, it's a little bit more of a qualitative discussion to have about, sort of being part of a community, being a leader in your industry. Maybe if there's a B2B company, maybe companies that are having, procurement, wanting to have sort of social, environmental, companies in their procurement supply chain. So I think it really depends, like making that case depends on what, sort of aspect it is. But as I've found in a lot of the companies that I've studied, it could be it's if the leaders are not aligned, at least in some way, with these changes, it's actually it could be very, very challenging. So, sometimes over time, when I've seen leadership change, that's actually a time when it's, most likely that those business cases can be made.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's
All right. Thank you so much, Shubha, for your question. All right. I'm checking now some of the questions here on our chat box. So this one is from, is it Jose or Josias Ding? How do you advise kicking start a sustainability conversation in Southeast Asia, especially in markets where the concept is still quite new and the focus is largely I think this largely still on financial returns?
Yeah, I think here is also where, I think a lot of, collective action sounds like protest type of things. I don't mean collective action in a protest way, but actually banding together can be very, very powerful. So, I know my time in a variety of Southeast, or sort of Asia and Southeast Asian context, there are a lot of events that are really trying to raise the public profile of, of these issues. So I think that one is just as the private sector, you can, work with, like-minded businesses, maybe others in your sector. I think two, getting connected to the investment community is a second sort of related way. I know a lot of so-called impact investors are interested in these topics, and increasingly, more mainstream investors also are interested. So, sort of partnering or working actually with investors, potentially that could be also on various sort of events or collective topics. And then finally, engaging in policy is important too, because many of this, ESG aspects are things that traditionally the governments would be more interested in. So that's a final one. I think in many ways, getting these issues on the public discussion and agenda is essential, because the more people are reading about it, seeing about it, hearing about brands that are following this, it has this sort of snowball type effect. So I think those are all a variety of ways.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, let's look at another question here. I can see a raised hand from Robin. Hi, Robin.
Yeah, hi. Basically, I find that there is a lot more interest in sustainability nowadays, but there are also a lot of pushbacks in the US on ESG as being a scam. And in your opinion, what's your opinion about this? And what can companies do to prevent themselves from looking like they're doing greenwashing?
Yeah, good. A couple of different questions. And where are you from, Robin?
I'm from Singapore, but I visit Boston a lot.
Okay, great, good. Well, glad you good. Yeah, that's something. Yeah, that's a very as an American, a close to home question. There has been a tremendous backlash against ESG in the U.S. And I'll sort of say a little bit about that, and then say a little bit about greenwashing too, which I see they're related but a little bit separate as well. If you look at a lot of that, so first of all, there's been a lot of discussion in the investment community for 10 plus years now about the importance of, be they called ESG metrics or CSR metrics, whatever, the importance of understanding those for measuring and getting a grip on risk management, long-term quality of the companies. And this is, Larry Fink famously had, a number of annual letters that describe this. As early as 2011 or 12, I actually wrote a Harvard Business School case study on Bloomberg, the Bloomberg terminal, which is, this incredible data portal for the investment industry. And they were actually putting ESG metrics on the Bloomberg terminal in 2012, so now 12 years ago, because investors wanted this, because they saw it as valuable for their, sort of an analysis of companies. So, the case study I wrote sort of documents how they went about that and, why it was important, et cetera. And this was, a long time ago. I think more recently, so this is something that wasn't actually that new. It was actually, pretty embedded in a lot of financial decision making. If you look at a lot of the anti-ESG movement, it actually stems from the fossil fuel interests. So there's been a variety of anti-ESG legislation in U.S. states. And there's been analyses of the language, and those are directly coming from actually, guidebooks and reports put out by fossil fuel industry think tanks. And so I think that it's, in the world, there are power and political contention that can happen. And I think that we need to be calling out a little bit more strongly the fact that a lot of this sort of anti-ESG focus is a lot about the self-interest of people that want to maintain, fossil fuels. So I think that's, one sort of one strategy. It seems that the, things will be better performing argument has sort of failed, but it's self-interest of the politicians and the companies behind that. The other thing about greenwashing, I think that this is one of the things that attracted me and why I focus so much on the B Corp movement. I think that having powerful accountability frameworks and reporting is really, really important. And I think there's also been this phenomena called green hushing, which maybe everyone knows of, or maybe not, I'm not sure. But green hushing is where companies are so afraid of being targeted because of their ESG performance from these anti-ESG forces that they now don't speak about anything. They just keep doing it because they believe in it or think it helps them or whatever, but they actually now no longer communicate about it. And I don't think that is necessarily the solution either, because I do think awareness around social, ESG topics is really, really important. I think being authentic about it is even more important. So this is where I think, accountability standards, and I think that it's a step in the right direction that the EU is being very proactive in setting standards that all companies are going to have to follow. So those are some thoughts, Robin. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Okie dokie. Thank you so much, Robin. And we have Sarah with her raised hand.
Hey, hi. Hi, Chris. Hi, Red. I'm, super happy to be part of, this session. Chris, I read your Better Business book. So, I'm like very, very happy to finally interact with you. So my question is actually a bit related to what you mentioned right now about the EU implementing, certain regulations about ESGs, and especially right now, with the CSRD. So my question would be, do you think that the rest of the regions, Asia and Latin America, in general, the rest of the world will also follow this pathway of drafting ESG-related laws? And if you think that it might, in case, it's the other way around, if it will backfire for the EU.
Sure. Good question. Where are you from, Sarah?
I'm from Mexico, but I live in Singapore.
Okay, great. Good. Well, thank you. Yeah, so good question. Yeah, so the second part of your question, I think, is sort of this backfiring. So one possible way that things like policies like this could backfire is where there ends up being a race to the bottom, so to speak, which we've seen globally at times where countries increase the stringency of their environmental regulations, and then companies just move out of there and go to some place where the environmental regulations are not as strong, or human rights, standards are not as strong. So this sort of, race to the bottom. That's, I think, always possible. Although, on the, to your question about it spreading to other regions, one of the reasons why I'm, somewhat optimistic about CSRD and the other work the EU is doing is that, they're very thoughtful in designing them in ways so that there can't be this, sort of, in some way, ESG arbitrage, I guess, is one way to think about it. So, for instance, CSRD, this Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, as it rolls out, and it's currently, I heard that there might be some slight delays, but the pilot phase, is going on now, or companies are going to report into some large companies are the first ones that are going to be reporting on their 2024 for sort of ESG performance and ESG results. They'll actually report on that in 2025. But the way it's sort of designed to roll out is within the next 4 to 5 years, most medium to large companies that have any exposure to the EU will be subject to that law for their entire organization. So, for instance, it's a pretty large company, but it's just an illustrative example. Nike, a US-based, shoe and apparel manufacturer, produces, is headquartered in the US, but, sells shoes all over the world, produces them
a lot in Asia and Southeast Asia. So because Nike has an EU, sells into the EU, they will be legally responsible. So legally being where their senior leaders and board can be sanctioned for inaccuracies or misrepresentations in their ESG statements for their entire global operation. So unlike, other, previous regulations where, maybe it only applied to the EU subsidiary, this applies to the global operations of these these companies that are selling or producing things in the EU. So I think the way that CSRD is designed to roll out is an attempt to get around this sort of race to the bottom. And I think in general, this has been the approach more recently. So another topic that you might know of or be familiar of, there's this carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM as it's known, which is also in the process of being rolled out. I think initially, applicable in some heavy industries like steel or cement. So, if, for instance, where there is carbon taxes in the EU, if China actually has been pretty proactive in its carbon market, so it might not be the best example, although there is a lot of steel that comes out of China. So let's say that a company from China, a company in Europe, is buying some steel from a Chinese company, and the Chinese company is not subject to the same sort of carbon taxes as an EU producer would be. There would be this border adjustment mechanism where that tax would still be assessed on the non-EU produced steel. So yeah, there is always a worry of the race to the bottom, but I do think the regulators are being more thoughtful in creating systems now where companies aren't able to do that, and they're So
Yeah, I mean, makes sense, like a domino effect, like they are implementing in Europe, but also thinking that it's possible to implement. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, we have one more in the forum. So this one is from Andreas. While the wave of bankruptcy hits small medium enterprises in Japan nowadays, the Japanese government let go their ESG concern and social cost and focus more on profiteers for small medium enterprises. I guess others will follow this unpopular action. What are your thoughts?
Great. So I'm not as familiar with the Japanese case. So what you're saying, Andres, is that they have already sort of backed away from various ESG concerns, or that's likely, or you think that that's what they'll do? I'll just answer it then. Go ahead.
Maybe you can just put a chat on so we can clarify your question, Andreas.
Have they already sort of backed away? Is that right? Anyways, that's okay. I'll just answer it as if they this, the idea of, governments not holding the line on environmental issues is, it's a challenging topic. The UK recently, the previous government, Rishi Sunak, who was just replaced, backed away from some of the net zero goals that because of financial issues. I think you see this in the US. I think Robin's comment, I think, also has a little bit of a lot of governments are worried about their financial position. They think some of these ESG topics will add to that. This is, I think, where continued pressure is really important, both as citizens for these countries like Japan or the UK or the US, where there's sort of votes and lobby pressure that can be placed on those countries, but also internationally, and there's the Paris Agreement and annual COP meetings where countries are held to account for their climate and other goals. And so I think it is a balance and challenge sometimes for democratically in democratic systems, where maybe if there's economic problems and if people are losing their jobs, they're not going to vote for those candidates. I think that's what Rishi Sunak in the UK was sort of focusing on, although it ended up not working too well for him, because his party was sort of massively sort of put out of jobs, the members of parliament. But I think it's sort of we as citizens and international community need to continue to put the pressure on those governmental actors, because it is, particularly on the climate, in the climate perspective, a real sort of salient issue. We're seeing the heat and the wildfires and the floods and the hurricanes and et cetera more and more. And so this is something that we all have to be very conscious of and address.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have another raised hand from Alfonso.
Great. Hello, Alfonso.
Hello, Christopher. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Nice to connect with you. I loved your book, Better Business, by the way. I'm based in Brazil, so it's a little early for me. My question is about the B Corp movement in general. So speaking about it and speak about companies with a positive impact overall, especially in the beginning, one of the challenges were to engage with multiple stakeholders, including governments, mainly because of the benefit corporation status, and investors as well. They're crucial in the movement. And nowadays, I'd like to talk about the current components and challenges in order to keep this movement moving forward.
Yeah, so you're asking about the current challenges in the B Corp movement. Is that right?
Yeah, to keep it going, if there are new challenges nowadays, and how this has changed over the years. Sure.
I mean, I think that one challenge that I know is salient in the community is, as the community has grown, there's worry that as larger companies are becoming certified B corporations, maybe the standards are not being as held as strictly as they should be, or as they were in the past. I think in many ways the B Corp movement, without the standards, there's really not much there. I mean, I think that's something that is really very sort of sacrosanct in this movement. So I think it's important personally to broaden the scope to larger companies, both because it's a mechanism for them to get better and change over time. But I know that that's something where there's a lot of discussion around, if we're certifying giant multinationals, what does that mean? Are they getting an easier way to pass because having Danone as a B Corp, for instance, and being able to communicate about the brand, is that a good thing? So I think that's one issue where there's a lot of discussion and challenges, and I don't think it's something that's sort of set yet. Another topic of discussion when I'm sort of out talking to B Corp groups is around the evolution of the standards. So I'm not sure how much of this hits the verification analyst community, which I guess some are on the call, and others, who are B Corps themselves, but the next version of the B impact assessment will be pretty fundamentally different than versions 1 to 6, in that there'll be a number of areas that companies will have things will be required to do in those areas, as opposed to just having to get a total cumulative score of 80, and maybe you're really great in environment, but don't do anything on for workers, et cetera. So I think that's another area where there's a lot of discussion and debate going on about, whether that's the right path, with the if all of the levels within those standards are very, very high, maybe a lot of companies that are existing B Corps will not be able to qualify, et cetera. So those are some of the areas that I'm, when I'm not talking to B Corps, I hear about.
Thank you. I'm a verification analyst as well. So I believe
Okay.
the second
Thank
topic you mentioned kind of complement the first one. So there are
Yes.
these
Yeah.
raising of concerns for big multinationals, and then the evolution of standards, let's hope it will fix it somehow.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Alfonso. Appreciate your question.
Now I'm anticipating that new change for the BIA now. So
Okay.
oh no, what's that? Okay. All right. I can see no more raised hands or questions in the chat. Anybody wanna ask before we go? Going once, going twice for the auction. No? Oh, okay. Alrighty, I think that pretty much concludes today's session, Doc. Thank you so much. This was an awesome session. Thank you for your time today. And to our audience, thank you very much as well for coming in. And we hope that today's webinar has been a great learning experience for everyone. So do drop us a feedback when you exit the Zoom meeting. Your browser will redirect you to a form once you exit.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Red. Thank you all for coming and talking. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thank you.